Is the second coming of Jesus Christ mentioned in the book of Revelation? If it's not at the Battle of Armageddon, for many believers it's contained in chapter 20, which is known as the Millennial Kingdom. Chapter 20 has its own sequence of events, beginning with the binding of Satan, where he cannot deceive the nations anymore. Then we see this time period of 1,000 years, and within that time period is the reign of Jesus Christ with presumably the martyrs. Then at the end of that period, Satan is released once more to deceive the nations before he is ultimately destroyed. Although the actual word is not mentioned in the Bible, the word millennium literally means 1,000 years. This 1,000-year reign of Christ is mentioned nowhere else in the Bible, and scholars have identified 3 theological positions in which they view this time period. This is why the doctrine of the Second Coming is so closely connected with this time period, because premillennialism believes that Jesus Christ will come before the 1,000 years will begin.
Many early Christians were preterists. They believed that on the basis of Revelation 20 and partially from reading 1 Corinthians 15 and a few other texts, that yes, Christ would come back and he would reign on earth for a long period of time before the last judgment, before the new heaven and new earth, before the final resurrection of those who were lost and that sort of stuff. And of course that comes from a fairly literal reading of Revelation 20 because it talks about 2 resurrections and etc.
Premillennialism would also be the position futurists would take because it fits in nicely within the sequence of events, but there is one major reason why they take this view. Yes, I've often wondered, was the millennium and the new heaven and new earth sort of intertwined? Because I suppose if we took a literal approach, it almost sounds like Christ has some work to do here in this life before we transcend into heaven. I wondered.
And that instinct that you've got there, Dale, wondering whether there's more interweaving going on, that is a kind of insight which has led people, and again we find this as early as the 3rd century, wondering whether the book is written in chronological sequence, or whether actually it's more kind of cycling. You know, John rarely says this happens and that happens. He says, I saw, and then I saw, and then I saw. So he's seeing things in some kind of visionary state. And he describes them, he's organized them in the book that he's subsequently written, in some kind of sequence, but the sequence he presents is a sequence in which he sees things, rather than the sequence in which they necessarily occur.
Again, premillennialists will go on the assumption that the book of Revelation is written in some chronological order that will predict the sequence of events that will happen in the end times. Premillennialists will also connect other sections of Revelation to fit in with this sequence. For example, in chapter 12, where it describes Satan's descent from heaven, they see that as the first step of the sequence, and then we live in the church age, then the millennial period of Christ will happen. But Ian goes on to explain that that can be read in a non-chronological way.
So in chapter 12, John sees a pregnant woman who then gives birth to a male child who will rule the nations with an iron scepter. Almost every interpreter has understood that to be Christ. So, you know, we're halfway through the book and then we've gone back to the birth of Christ. So, at times it seems that we're being presented less with a straightforward chronological sequence and more with different ways of looking at the same reality presented to us in the sequence in which John sees them.
There are also other strains of premillennialism, such as historic premillennialism, post-tribulational premillennialism, and also premillennial dispensationalism. Dispensationalism we have already identified. This was the idea developed by John Nelson Darby, in which you separate the world's history into dispensations, or ages. This is also the background to the idea of wanting to separate Jews from Christians in the end times. And in fact, many people see the millennial kingdom as part of the final Sabbath rest period for the Jews. Just like we see in the Old Testament, the Jews were to have a day of rest on the seventh day. Many people also believe that if the world is only 6,000 years old, then the next 1,000 years would have to be a time of rest. This of course would also have to depend on your view on the age of the earth, and if you take a evolutionary point of view, or a literal 6th day of creation from the book of Genesis.
Revelation's promise that when he comes, there's going to be a lot to do before we get to the new creation. I mean, even 1 Corinthians 15 says he's got to put all of his enemies under his feet, and the last one will be death, it says. So there's this process that's going to happen when Christ returns. The dead in Christ will be raised first. There's a period of him reigning on the earth, and then et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so there is a premillennialism to the faith of the earliest Christians. It's just not dispensational pre-mill.
Of course, the one question that has to be asked is the 1,000 years a literal 1,000-year period?
It means 1,000, so that's where the word comes from. But it's kind of come to mean in contemporary culture some kind of dawning 1,000-year golden age. So, in New Age, you get the Age of Aquarius. The Third Reich of Nazi Germany was going to be last 1,000 years. So, it's kind of entered into the popular, particularly European mindset around images of a new dawning golden age in whatever era it is people happen to be proclaiming it.
Maybe not viewing the 1,000 years as a literal time period has made scholars see it in a different way. This leads us to post-millennialism. This is the idea that Christ will return to the earth after the 1,000 years have begun. The 1,000 years doesn't necessarily mean it's a literal 1,000 years, but rather they see it as a time where the church will bring about a golden age in order to prepare the way for the coming of the Christ. This would bring about a healthy response in viewing the world. In other words, seeing it as a place that's getting better and better, rather than a place that seems to be getting worse and worse, which is what a lot of end-time believers tend to turn to. So post-millennialists believe that after Jesus ascended into heaven, they see the millennial age as something that is done through the workings of the church. And of course that gets you away from a literal 1,000-year period, because it's been over 2,000 years since Jesus Christ was on this earth. So a good example would be Jesus' words from Matthew 24:14. This good news of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world for a testimony to all the nations. Then the end will come. Is that a literal prediction of what will happen before the end times? And could it also fit into a post-millennial position? But of course we know that numbers are quite symbolic in the book of Revelation.
Elsewhere in the book, numbers seem to have symbolic significance. The number 7 is the obvious example. Perfect number associated with God, 3, plus the number associated with the created world, 4. 6, 1 less than 7, imperfection. 12, the number of the 12 tribes. And the dimensions of the holy city, the New Jerusalem, are multiples of 12, if you notice. And we also have the number 1,000, which is it's a biblical number for a large number. If you can't, you've got to think of something large, you think of 1,000, and then multiples of thousands. And of course, it's the square of 10. So, the number 1,000 is an appropriate number to think of a temporary, but in some sense perfect reign.
This is on top of other Bible passages that explain that one day to God is like 1,000 years, and vice versa. And then to see it in a completely symbolic way, the third view is amillennialism. Amillennialism just means no millennium.
Now, seeing it in that kind of more symbolic but profoundly real way, symbolic is not necessarily unreal, will explain why some Christian readers of the book, particularly from Augustine onwards, and this was then affected the way in which Christians read this for much of the Middle Ages, sometimes connected the millennium with the New Jerusalem. And they also saw the millennium as beginning not with the resurrection of the dead, not with the final coming of Christ, but with his first coming. So from Christ coming among us, the kingdom has broken in, the millennium has begun. So for Augustine, in his later views about the millennium, this is a symbolic number describing the change in his history, the change at the heart of the cosmos, which occurred when the Word became flesh, when Christ came among us for the first time, and will be consummated at the end with his second coming.
But nonetheless, there were many premillennial Christians, especially in the 2nd century and into the 3rd century, and the father of church history, Eusebius, hated it. I mean, he really did not like it. And he did everything he could to say, well, this is overly earthly theology, overly literal reading of text. And the person who followed him was, of course, Augustine. And it really is Augustine that put his stamp on the idea that no, the church is the representation of the kingdom come on earth. And so, in fact, eschatology began with the incarnation of Jesus, and we have been in the so-called church age, the millennium, ever since the coming of Christ. So he was basically what today is called amillennialism, was in millennialism. We're already in the millennium.
So this interpretation places it in the past rather than the future, and that the binding of Satan actually occurred when Jesus was crucified, when he defeated sin and death. Another connection could be found in one of the parables, in which Jesus explains how can Satan cast out Satan, and he uses the image that you have to bind the strong man in order to enter his house. Many people see the strong man as Satan himself.
Big problem with that. Satan seems to be doing quite well during this age, whereas Revelation 20 says he's in a jail cell and can't get out and can't deceive anybody. Well, that certainly doesn't adequately describe church history at all. But really, I mean, it's because of the influence of people like Eusebius and Augustine that you have the rise of an amillennial theology.
However, Simon thinks we can locate ourselves in a different position within Revelation 20. Would you say then, Simon, it's fair to say that the millennium, this millennium passage, should almost be separated from the doctrine of the second coming? Is this a completely different thing?
I do think that, yeah. I think what we've got going on here is at the end of the millennium, Satan is released for a little while from the pit. So within chapter 20, Satan is bound, cast into the pit. Then you've got the 1,000-year reign of the saints with Christ. And then at the end of it, Satan is let out for a little while and makes war against the camp of the saints. So it's clearly not the end of all things, this millennium. It's an inserted image into the scheme. And I think if John wants his readers to imagine themselves somewhere in this text, it's in that little period where Satan has been let out again, but has not yet been finally defeated. And I think that's where we can locate ourselves in this text. So you've got the martyrdom of Jesus. You know, he's kind of the first of the Christian martyrs. He's resurrected, but he dies at the hands of the empire. So all of those other martyrs who die are united with Christ in his death, as they will be united with Christ in his resurrection, but they're united with him in death. So you've got this image of the martyrs and the martyred Christ, not dead, but reigning. And then the defeat of Satan at that point is assured. His number is up, but he's not yet finished. And then he's released for a little while to make war on the saints, and that's where we live.
We often think of this as the 1,000-year reign of Christ. Revelation actually doesn't say that. He says that those who are raised, probably the martyrs, reign with Christ for 1,000 years. So their reign is 1,000 years, without passing any comment on how long Christ's reign is.
So I think that's kind of the theological scheme, but I read it theologically. I don't read it as a prediction of something that's going to be worked out in kind of measurable human history. I think it's worked out in my life and your life and all of our lives, that I think it helps with human experience and helps people understand in that way.
Of course, the futurist reading would see the time period known as a little while, something that is going to happen after the literal 1,000-year millennial kingdom reign of Christ. But it also assumes that Jesus Christ will return at this exact moment. And so far, from what I'm hearing, that doesn't seem to be the case. I got wondering about the very nature of the second coming of Christ itself.
I'm going to ask a very strange, blunt question now, if this is okay, and it may seem very strange. Is there such a thing as the second coming?
I'm going to give you another one of my no and yes answers. If what we're talking about is some decisive point in human history when Jesus descends on a cloud to the Mount of Olives, and all those people who are alive at that point see that happen in some way, and there's a lot of thought that the digital age might be what allows that to happen. I've heard all of that stuff. No, I don't believe that. Okay, I don't think that the second coming of Jesus is something that's going to happen either in my lifetime in that way or at any point in the future. And I don't think that's really what these texts are trying to predict. I think what they're trying to say is that Jesus, who was died and has been raised and is with God, comes again and again and again to the earth. So I would say that, yes, I have experienced in my life the second coming of Jesus, as have you in yours. He comes to us in, not in physical form. That was the first coming. The second coming is he comes by his Spirit, transforming our lives and through us transforming the world. So I do believe in it, but I kind of interpret it slightly differently. I take a non-futuristic view. I think it's fulfilled in the coming of Jesus to his followers by his Spirit.
It would be true to say that there is such a thing as the second coming.
It all depends what you mean by it. I mean, I can think of interpreters of the second coming who see that as the universal presence of Christ in humanity. So that's definitely not a literal interpretation. But I think, insofar as one considers the New Testament texts, I think that New Testament writers who mention it certainly have the view that Christ is going to appear from heaven and resume his role within the kingdom of God, and that will be seen by all flesh. And he may well reign in heaven now, but that's not where he's going to reign. So it's going to be heaven on earth.
Satan is out of the way. Evil, chaos, destruction out of the way. And we catch a glimpse of what the world looks like with Christ and his martyrs in charge. It's almost as if we get a glimpse of the kingdom of God. And then the action starts up again with the release of Satan, and then the kind of final wrapping up, the destroying of the destroyers of the earth, which culminates with the last enemy, as Paul says, to be destroyed, death and Hades being thrown into the lake of fire. And then the scene is set for the descent of the New Jerusalem.
I think thinking of the second coming of Christ solely in terms of him coming from heaven misses the point of that total hope for the future. His coming from heaven is in order to see a fulfillment or completion of that which was begun in his ministry in Galilee and Jerusalem. There he is quite clearly depicted as the agent of the coming kingdom, and that's been rudely interrupted by the actions of his opponents and his ultimately his death, but is going to be completed in the future, and when he will reign, or to use Paul's language in 1 Corinthians 15, he will reign until he has put all things under subjection to himself. So yes, that is kind of setting things right where things had gone wrong, thanks to the abuse of the creation by the principalities and powers.
If we return to our New Testament text that many people say predicts a rapture, we can see that the coming of the Lord was predicted here, and that's among others, such as the predictions in John's Gospel and the book of Hebrews. It seems less likely that ideas are added into the scripture, but rather it's more about how you interpret it to make it fit into whatever theory you need. And for the futurist reading, they need the premillennial one to be true in order to fit in with their sequence of events. But now we come to the final step in the sequence, the new heaven and the new earth. Can we find any more answers in this section?